Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's turn to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Summit in Washington this week. Kate, we're taping this before the summit begins, but to the extent that the agenda has been signaled in advance, what are the main takeaways that listeners should have about what NATO is up to?
Well, I think all of the focus has been on Biden's own political prospects and whether he can weather another week of calls for him to drop out of the presidential election. And he seems to see the NATO summit as an opportunity to show he's still capable of running the country. I think that's unfortunate because I think there is a lot of substance on the docket at the summit this week. Some things that I'm watching for really are about whether the alliance rolls out a new long-term package for Ukraine of military aid. NATO wants to take some of that military aid over and coordinating it and dealing with the international assistance. This has been presented in some quarters as buying an insurance policy against Trump so that NATO can keep funding Ukraine if Trump comes into office. I think that's a huge mistake. I think the reality of the package is that it should be about Europe meeting its commitments to defend Europe over the long haul and showing that Putin's gamble that he can take over Ukraine by just making incremental progress, waiting out the West, that's not going to pay off. So I think the Ukraine package is worth watching. But just one other thing would be whether the allies are willing to revisit their spending commitments. The 2% of GDP marker was agreed to in 2014. To a lot of fanfare, 23 of NATO allies of 32 are on track to meet that commitment in 2024, which is up from 3 in 2014. But it's clearly the 2% marker is outdated and the world doesn't look like it did in 2014. So the question is whether you could get some momentum to agree to a higher level, closer to 2.5, closer to even 3%. Only about 5 allies are meeting a 3% marker, and it's basically the Baltic countries who really understand the threat that Russia poses. And then finally, the spending numbers are important, but only if the underlying ability to defend Europe has been fleshed out. And I think NATO has made some progress in recent years, kind of organizing its collective defense plans and a better division of labor of, okay, which countries are going to provide which assets to the fight. I know that there's a lot of conventional wisdom that Russia simply doesn't pose a threat to NATO because NATO militaries are so far superior, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia couldn't present a huge problem for NATO, particularly in the Baltics and the Blitz campaign. I mean, NATO doesn't have a lot of force concentrated on the Eastern Front. NATO has struggled to keep up with Russian artillery production. So these are the kind of hard topics I think that should be the focus of the week's summit, more so than Biden's own political prospects.
Here's the quote from the NATO Secretary General on the Ukraine shift. He says, NATO will take over the coordination and provision of most international security assistance, unquote. And Kim, I guess I take Kate's point that to the extent that this is being pitched as a Trump-proofing of the Ukraine Defense Assistance Project, it seems to me that might needlessly inflame President Trump and his supporters. And at this point in the 2024 election campaign, it looks like Donald Trump is probably the favorite to be the next president through 2028. And so maybe NATO does not need that inflaming of the guy who is going to be the commander in chief potentially for the next 4 years. On the other hand, I do still think there are questions about what Donald Trump's foreign policy is supposed to look like over the next 4 years, both in Ukraine, but also with regard to NATO. And I would point back to President Trump's debate against President Biden in late June. And he was there on the debate stage bragging again that he was in a very secret meeting, as he called it, of the 28 states at the time of NATO. And he was asked whether he would defend them. And Trump bragged again that he said, no, if you don't pay, I won't do that. And so, Kim, I still do think there's a potential vulnerability for him here in that voters who are worried about the chaos of the Trump years returning, that sounds like Donald Trump hasn't necessarily backed off that idea.
Well, to the NATO point, this was a silly move on their part, both by NATO leadership, but by European heads and delegates that are leaking this notion to the press that they are baking in these commitments as an insurance policy against a Donald Trump Trump presidency. This is not the way you go about courting the potential would-be next leader of the United States, who is so central to your organization. They should be doing what they can to build those bridges and maintain good relations with a possible future president, especially because Trump has expressed some skepticism. Now, let me put it this way when it comes to Trump. I think Donald Trump's threats that he makes and the fact that he has leaked those have been in aid of him trying to broadcast that he got results. And we can't ignore that there has been a change, and a change for the better, given the pressure that he did put on NATO. If you go back to 2014, there were only 3 countries that were making that 2% commitment, and now we're approaching 23 of the 32. I agree with Kate, that number needs to be even higher. And those are the unknown questions for Trump. I think what he has broadcast pretty clearly is that his main interest is that NATO step up and fulfill its commitments, and that assuming it does, he's a huge fan of this alliance and understands its importance. He needs to be far more clear about his views on that, about his views of European common defense, our role in it, and the Ukraine conflict, and how he views this new unsettled world now that Putin's aggression, and China too. That was another, I think it's going to be an important part of this NATO conversation, as there was a recognition going into this that China is the main financial backer of Russia's war, and that puts China very much more on NATO's radar. All of those things Donald Trump needs to be a lot more clear about. But playing politics this early in the game before he's made that clarity, I think is damaging to the organization.
Kate, we'll give you the last word, but perhaps President Trump does deserve some credit for more NATO members meeting that 2% target. On the other hand, there's a lot that has happened since 2014, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which seems to have really put the fear of God into some of these countries, particularly in Eastern Europe.
Where I think Trump deserves credit on this issue is that he did identify a salient issue early, which was that the Europeans were not meeting their defense commitments. However, I do think when you look at the data, it's pretty clear that what spurred Europe to change its behavior really was Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, an example from today's editorial, the Dutch were spending 1.3% of its economy on defense in 2021. I mean, that's a pitiful number. It's not even close to 2%. They're now set to eke out 2.05% in 2024. So it's very obviously Putin's aggression that's driving this change. I think there was a lot of thinking in Europe that, well, Putin wouldn't really roll in tanks to Kiev. He would launch a hybrid war. He'd do a more minor military action. And so I think to have a basically World War I artillery land war in Eastern Europe has changed the dynamics in Europe. I think Trump can still, point out that this has been an issue of his for a while, and he can capitalize on that issue. I think, for instance, he's been thinking about rolling out a 3% marker for NATO allies, and I think that would be a decent challenge to issue to allies at this point. Well, the 2% marker was not fit for a China, Russia, Iran axis that's challenging the U.S. and other Western nations across multiple theaters. And to Kim, I think connecting those dots is correct, that what's going on in the Pacific is increasingly NATO's problem if you have China bankrolling and helping Putin's invasion. So I think there's opportunity for Trump to take the political opening here, but I think it's unfortunate that he keeps retreating to these reckless remarks about how, well, if you don't pay, I won't defend you. I don't think that's how he will get the high ground from this. And I also think Biden has a lot of vulnerabilities. He gets a lot of credit for uniting NATO after the Ukraine invasion, but he doesn't get enough criticism for how he's handled the Ukraine war, for what he did in the run-up to the invasion, that withdrawing from Afghanistan, calling it a potential minor incursion. I mean, there's a lot of vulnerability there that Trump hopefully will shrewdly go after if he wants to win on this issue.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.